After 10 days of threats from President Trump to levy tariffs on Mexican products because of migration into the United States, Mr. Trump announced Friday night that he had struck a deal to both stem the movement of people and avoid opening another front in a trade war. But as Nick Schifrin tells us, the details are important, and what happens now is open for interpretation.
These are the images Mexico wants the U.S. to see. Mexican police detaining Honduran immigrants, preventing them from moving north to the U.S. Mexico vows to accelerate the deployment of its National Guard to cities and its southern border. On its northern border with the U.S., Mexico promises to accept more Central Americans who applied for U.S. asylum and provide them with better shelter, food, and education than they currently receive. And Mexico promises to better track Central Americans currently waiting in long lines at Mexican immigration offices, Mexico's Foreign Secretary Marcelo Ebrard said today.
We are going to ask them to register, and we will tell them what the options are. Mexico cannot permit a flow of 1.5 million people without knowing their names.
President Trump told CNBC today the Mexican moves could work.
The people from Guatemala, the people from Honduras and El Salvador, in theory, if they do it right, they're not going to be able to get through. Nobody's going to be able to get through. And then they're also going to protect our southern border. So it should have a big impact.
The agreement was announced Friday night after a week of meetings and a presidential threat of escalating tariffs. Today, President Trump said those tariffs scared Mexico into making concessions.
This is something the U.S. has been trying to get for over 20 years with Mexico. They've never been able to do it. As soon as I put tariffs on the table, it was done. It took 2 days.
But Mexico had already promised to track Central Americans, deploy National Guardsmen, and accept asylum seekers. On ABC News, Democratic presidential candidate Beto O'Rourke called the tariff threat counterproductive.
They might have accelerated the timetable, but by and large, the president achieved nothing except to jeopardize the most important trading relationship that the United States of America has.
But this afternoon, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said these agreements went further than Mexican promises made last year.
The scale, the effort, the commitment here is very different from what we were able to achieve back in December.
To talk about that debate and get a firsthand look at the impact of these agreements, we turn to our own Amna Nawaz, who's in El Paso, and journalist James Frederick, who's based in Mexico City and joins us from Tapachula, Mexico, Mexico's southern border near Guatemala. James Frederick, let me start with you. The steps that Mexico has promised, accelerating the deployment of National Guard, taking in more asylum seekers that are sent from the U.S., better registering people who are moving to the north. Are those steps new?
I wouldn't say they're new. What I'd say they are is ramping up what Mexico's been doing for the last few years. This is not a brand new thing for Mexico to be detaining and deporting migrants, but this definitely feels like a ramp up. For the National Guard, what Mexico has said is that it's going to send it to the actual border with Guatemala, which when I was there yesterday was still totally open. Migrants cross totally freely. And so that would be new if Mexico enforced the border itself. Right now, all the enforcement it does is mostly on highways where it tries to catch migrants traveling in buses.
So those highway checkpoints, you and I saw those when you and I were working together down there 2 years ago. They were sporadic 2 years ago. Is there signs that Mexico is stepping up those checkpoints? And are there signs that Mexico is actually taking steps to really impact the structural problems of migration?
You can definitely see more checkpoints nowadays. There's a lot more than when you and I were working together here. So you can feel that difference. Structurally, it's hard to tell if anything is really going to change here because, as we've seen many times, when you put authorities out on highways, that just means that most migrants go and they walk in more rural areas. Many are getting back on the freight train called La Bestia to try to get north. So there's more enforcement, but it's not clear whether that's just going to push migrants further out or whether that is actually going to stop people from getting to the U.S.
Amna, one of the major attempts by Mexico, they say they're going to try and take in more asylum seekers who actually get to the U.S. And then come back into Mexico, offer them food, education, shelter. This is, as we've been talking about, something Mexico's already promised. Is there any sign that you've seen that Mexico has been doing this and is capable of doing it?
So far, Nick, we visited a couple of shelters that cropped up to try to take in some of those migrants who have been sent back by the U.S. across legal ports of entry like this one behind me. Unequivocally, I'd say the answer is no. Look, there's not much that the Mexican government has been doing so far. That program that sends people back from the U.S. has been in place for months here in El Paso, is now going to be spread across the border, the southern border. But there just aren't the resources to be able to provide those kinds of services to those migrants. These towns on the Mexican side of the border towns there, they're being similarly overwhelmed. Here on the El Paso side, over in Juarez, they've got about 5,000 people they did not expect to be housing. The shelters that we visited asked the federal government for whatever help they can get. Some of them said so far over the last few months, they've only received 2 food shipments. That is it. That's the only assistance they've gotten from the Mexican government. Another place, they are reliant on the Mexican government to pay for their electricity bill. It hadn't been paid. The lights were off. They don't know when they're coming back on. So far, we have not seen the resources coming from the Mexican government in any kind of organized or regular way. I guess we'll have to wait and see what happens next.
As you said, you're talking to a lot of Central Americans who are moving their way north or trying to get to the U.S. Any sign that these agreements will change what they're thinking, perhaps even reduce the likelihood of their moving north?
So we talked to a couple of people in those shelters, right? Folks who had either been told to wait their turn in line, meaning they tried to cross legally. They said the U.S. port of entry is full. Go back, put your name on a list, and come back. That list, by the way, runs several thousand long. People are waiting several months just for their first chance to go into the ports of entry. We also talked to people who've been sent back to Mexico, meaning they had crossed, they'd been apprehended on the U.S. side, and then they were sent back and are awaiting a court date. Most people said they're going to wait as long as they need to, but immigration advocates we've talked to, folks who are tracking this kind of thing, particularly on the Mexican side of the border, tell us they worry that those families, a lot of them, because they are so desperate, because they don't have the means to spend months at a time in limbo, waiting in Juarez and other border towns on the Mexican side, they worry those folks are going to be further incentivized to try to then cross illegally. And they say that they know there are a ton of smuggling networks, a lot of contacts who are waiting in those border towns to prey on those people.
James Frederick, administration officials say there's actually more in this agreement than has been made public. The U.S. has been pushing for Mexico to become a safe third country, meaning they would have to take in all asylum seekers, regardless of where those people are from. Mexican officials have resisted that. Any sign that Mexico is now considering that option?
Mexican officials have not said anything to that effect yet. I think the main thing to say about that is kind of echoing what Ann was saying up on the U.S.-Mexico border, is here on the Guatemala-Mexico border, there are tons of people, Central Americans as well as Africans and Haitians I've met here, are trying to apply for asylum in Mexico. Mexico's refugee agency only has a budget of $1.2 million, and it expects to receive 60,000 asylum seekers this year. So again, without the resources, it's just impossible that Mexico could really take in people who are fleeing their countries from persecution.
Amna, you've been to that border so often. You've talked to so many people on both sides. You know so much about this issue. The challenge that James just described, are you seeing a fundamental shift or any change at all in those trends?
Look, over time, we know that there are historically seasonal changes, right? As it gets hotter over the summer, those numbers could dip a bit. But for all the conversation around some of those pull factors, right? We talk about this a lot in Washington and in the U.S., that we need to change asylum laws, that other structural things need to change so people aren't incentivized to come. There isn't enough conversation around the push factors, those things that are forcing those people to leave largely those 3 Central American countries in the first place. So, there's consensus among a lot of folks we talk to, even right here in El Paso. We've got officials here saying unless we address some of those root causes, this isn't going to change anytime soon.
Our own Amna Nawaz down on the border in El Paso. Journalist James Frederick joining us on Skype from the Guatemala-Mexico border. Thanks very much to you both.